Hi to all of you. I'm here again to share another lesson in education, and this time we will be talking about language teaching methodologies. So we'll be looking at the methods of language teaching used during the 19th century to the early 21st century. We are going to observe as well the emphasis of language teaching in those methods that were used before. So to give you the rundown of what the things that we're going to study, we are going to talk about grammar translation method, natural approach, direct method, situational language teaching, constructivist analysis, audiolingual method, total physical response, student-centered learning, total communication, interactive approaches, and computer-assisted language learning. Okay, so I hope that you learned something from this video, and I hope that you can apply it once you become a language teacher. So let's start with grammar translation approach. So the emphasis of grammar translation approach is actually the use of mother tongue in instruction. So grammar translation approach was used in Europe in teaching Latin and Greek before, and it was also applied in teaching French, German, and English in the 19th century. So as they teach the language, they translate it to mother tongue or the first language of the students. Okay, so it's teacher-centered because teachers consume much of the time giving instruction and teaching the students. Therefore, students or pupils have little time or less time in using the language, in using the things that they've learned in their English classes. Therefore, the less chances that they could use the vocabularies that they've learned, the pronunciation that they've learned, and so on and so forth. And vocabulary taught through words list and translation. So students here are given a lot of words to memorize. So in a day, they have a bunch of words to memorize, and they tend to translate it as well in their mother tongue so that they can understand it better. Okay? And reading of literary passages, even at low levels, with reading comprehension questions. So they also read literary passages in the target language, but for understanding, most teachers translate it as well in mother tongue, and they give questions for comprehension questions or assessing if the students or pupils really understood what they have read. Okay, and practice based on translation of text to and from mother tongue. So it's heavily translation approach as well, right? They tend to translate a term or words from the first language to the second language, or the second language to the first language, and elaborate presentation of grammar rules. So they teach grammar intensively, and students also memorize the rules of grammar so that they can apply it in writing or even in speaking. But again, speaking is not the emphasis or focus of grammar translation. Okay, and vocabulary exercises include antonyms, synonyms, definitions, etc., based on words in reading text. So you can see here, they focused more on the expansion of a vocabulary, right? The more vocabulary you have, the more words you have, the better you'll learn the language. That's the view in grammar translation method, and it's better to understand the terms and the words in the target language if those words are also translated in their first language. And again, instruction is given using their mother tongue. And composition exercises based on topics from readings. It only says here that if you will be teaching and using this grammar translation approach, you must have to be familiar, and you must have to be a master also of the first language of the student. So here in the Philippines, our first language could be Ilocano, Chabacano, etc., Filipino. Now, if you will be using this one, you must be familiar as well with the first language so that you can translate the material, you can teach them using their first language. Natural approach, Object and actions are used to teach meaning of words. So this is different from grammar translation because in natural approach we use objects. Okay, we could use realia if we can bring an object inside the classroom, or we can use pictures in order to represent the meaning of the word. Okay, say for example, you are defining invertebrates, right? You can probably give pictures to present pictures to your students, or you can also bring models right inside the classroom so that they could easily understand what's the meaning of that word. All right. Okay. And spoken language was emphasized. Okay. Before, it's just memorization of words words, grammar as well. Here, the emphasis is given to spoken language. Language should be taught following the natural principles of first language. So it's a belief in this approach that the way we learn the first language should be the same the way we use the second language. Okay, that's the natural approach. However, that is also the weakness of this approach because it was studied by different researchers and linguists that the way we learn the second language different from the way we acquire the first language. Okay, and natural communication is more important than formal grammar. In natural communication, the way students would use the target language to communicate with their parents, with their teachers, with their classmates. That's the natural communication. Okay, so less emphasis on formal grammar. Okay, because they know that natural communication is the very goal of learning the language, and language learners' errors during interaction can be tolerated. That is very important as language teachers. You have to really tolerate the errors of your students when it comes to language learners. Well, depending on your objective on the lesson, but if you keep on correcting the grammar of your students, if they're speaking, if you keep on correcting their pronunciation as they speak, then most likely what will happen is that your students or pupils will not have the guts to answer and to speak out anymore inside your classroom because they would think of the mistakes that they might commit, and so that will hinder them in uttering sentences uttering sentences. Okay, so that is not effective really inside the classroom. Could you just imagine yourself, for example, your teacher often corrects you every time you commit mistakes in grammar or in pronunciation, so that would that would demotivate you to speak the language anymore. And this approach led rather to the direct method. The direct method is kind of similar to natural method. So this is also a response to the grammar translation method, and it draws emphasis or attention to the learner's practical speaking skills. The emphasis also here is the speaking skills of the learners, just like natural approach. So all teaching is done in the target language. So unlike in grammar translation, in direct method, the teacher has to model the language so that the students could imitate it. Okay, so instruction is given using the target language. So there's a focus on speaking and listening, and also only useful everyday language is taught. Both teacher and students should use as much as a target language as they can, because in language learning, the more you practice speaking, the more you use the language in communication, the more you learn it. Okay, it's not about memorizing. Okay, it's about using what you've learned, because language learning, language is really skills to be learned by students. That's not something to be memorized. And then next approach is situational language teaching. So from 1930, it was developed and applied in education between 1930s to 1960s. Basis of language teaching: speech, structures, and basic vocabulary items. So focus on both vocabulary and reading is the most salient trait of STL. In fact, mastery of set of high-frequency vocabulary items believed to lead to good reading skills. Okay, vocabulary once again is the focus in this approach, because they believe that the more words you know, the better you understand the text that you are reading. So it will lead you to good reading skills. And an analysis of English in a classification of its prominent grammar structures into sentence patterns, also called situational tables, is believed to help learners internalize grammatical rules. So you let them analyze. So you don't just let them memorize rules, but you help them analyze the classification of these grammatical structures, so that they could internalize, okay, these rules in grammar, and therefore would be permanent in their learning of the language. Okay, the objective of situational language teaching involves accurate use of vocabulary items and grammar rules in order to achieve a practical mastery of four basic skills. So in this approach, there's also an emphasis on the four basic skills, or these are also called the four macro skills. So what are these macro skills? We have listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So learners must be able to produce accurate pronunciation and use of grammar. So focus on vocabulary, focus on grammar, and focus on pronunciation, okay, to develop the four macro skills. That's based on this approach. And lastly, the ultimate aim is to be able to respond quickly and accurately in speech situations. That's why it's called situational language approach or teaching. Okay, we could use the language that we learned, our second language, in any situation. So for example, you go outside, you talk to your teacher. You could use your language skills to talk to other professionals, or to talk to other students, or to talk with the community, to collaborate with the community. Okay, next is constructivist analysis. It is a technique comparing linguistic system of two languages. For instance, the pronunciation system or the grammatical structure. So we tend to compare the two languages that we have, our first language and the second language, or the target language. For instance, our first language is Filipino. We try to compare that to the grammar structure of our second language, English, or even the pronunciation. So for example, in a grammatical structure in English, it's always SVO, or subject verb object. Well, if you compare that to the Filipino language, it's not always like that, because verb could also be could come first also before objects. For example, gumagawa ako ng homework. Gumagawa is pandiwa, or gumagawa ako ng takdang aralin. So gumagawa is pandiwa or verb. So verb could also come first. So there is a comparison in both languages, and also with pronunciation, right? There are instances that we could not easily pronounce some of the words and sounds of the English language, because those sounds do not really appear in or exist in our language. So like for the sound of V, right? The V sound, sometimes we say it as B. For example, vase, instead of saying vase, we Filipinos sometimes would say base, because we don't have V sound in the Filipino language. That's also true with the sound of letter F, the sound of letter F, right? Sometimes we pronounce that as what? P, right? Instead of saying father, we would say father, right? And so on and so forth, right? So we tend to compare the linguistic system of two languages, right? It is based on the foundations that the main difficulties in learning the language. So this is called the interlanguage, actually. So it states here that the main problem in learning the second language is because of our first language. So it becomes now a hindrance, right? So, however, there are researchers right now who oppose this one, who debunk this, theory. But based on this, let's try to understand first what's this. Okay, they say that our first language is the very reason, or could the very reason why there is an interference in learning the second language. So uh, they said that, well, it's true that our first language always affects our second language. That's the reason why we sometimes mispronounce English words, right? Okay. So with that, it has led to better teaching performance in teaching pronunciation. So if they've seen already the differences, then they could probably forecast the difficulty of the students in learning pronunciation or grammar or structure. Then teachers can now make an intervention for that, can now design an appropriate strategy for that. Okay, next is audiolingual method. This pedagogy emphasizes that teaching, speaking, and listening should be in the earlier stage of teaching, reading, and writing. So it must be honed first to the children, listening and speaking, okay, before reading and writing. So it dejects the teaching through mother tongue and encourages most of the English teaching should apply the target language to instruct. So I mean, they also encourage the use of English, of course, in instruction, in teaching, and so on and so forth, so that they could acquire, the proficiency in English. When the instructors utilize target language to lecture, students will be able to attain their occasion where they can accumulate the knowledge of the target language. So that explains that one. When students are accumulating their knowledge of the target language, they are at the same time recognizing the difference between their target language and their mother tongue. I think that's self-explanatory in that part. Next is total physical response. Teaching contents are instructed through orders, commands, and instruction, demanding the learners or even teachers physical response through body gestures and through languages and gestures. So we show it to them. Okay, we make actions in order for them to easily understand a term or a sentence. Say, for example, you're teaching the structure or the sentence. Would you mind closing the door? So if you teach that to your students, and if you wanted to really understand the meaning of that, you have to show them. So you show them like you're closing the door, so that they would understand the meaning of the sentence. So you show it to them. That's the physical response. Okay, so it's very effective, especially to beginning levels. So for elementary, you can always use total physical response to teach your students. Okay? It's not always translation. There could also be other approaches that you can use to help them understand what you're teaching to them. Okay? All right. Next, student-centered learning. Students' cooperation is accentuated. Okay. Student-centered. Students here are given much time and have a lot of opportunities to collaborate and to interact with the teacher and with the other students. That way, they could use the language authentically in different situations. So paired discussion or group brainstorming activities are regarded as more significant than the teacher's tutoring. So teachers do not feed the students with learnings. Okay, instead they guide them, they facilitate them so that they can learn better through cooperation. And it is still growing until 21st century. Teachers are students' consultants, advisors, instead of authentic teachers or professors. Okay? Yeah, I think it's still effective even right now in the 21st century. Okay, next is total communication. Total communication was really originally a method developed for teaching hearing damaged children based on concurrent application of sign language and spoken language. So it was developed because of the needs of the other learners who have special needs. So, for example, you're teaching students who have difficulty in listening, right? You could probably used this approach to teach them. So it used a number of modes in communication, such as signed, okay, sign language, oral, auditory, written, and visual aids, depending on, of course, the difficulty or the abilities of needs and difficulties of your pupils. However, although it is used mainly for that, and it was developed because of that, it can still be used and can also be applicable to speakers, to students whose first language is not English. Okay, so for us, it could also be effective to younger learners. This total communication. Next is interactive approaches. The language teachers can play as a controller, director, manager, facilitator, resource provider. So this is not really teacher-centered. This the emphasis here is the use of language authentically in interactive communications. Okay, so students have again ample time to use their language in different tasks given, of course, by the teacher. So through student and student interaction and the teacher and student interaction, a class might be more effective due to the frequent interactions appearing in the class. So they might be, as long as you sustain the motivation to use the target language, they wouldn't mind. It would come to the point that they would not observe themselves that they're already speaking the target language. It's because of the task that you give to them. Do not force them to use the English language, but you could motivate them to use it for communicative discourse inside your classroom. It depends on the strategy of the teacher. So in truth, the final goal of language learning is for gaining proficiency of really interacting and communicating. So it could pave way to develop the development of the proficiency of the students. So this is also very effective. Okay, computer assisted language learning. So it was developed because of the speedy development of computer science technology. So nowadays, teachers and schools are already using technology to aid language learning, right? So basically, teachers use audio, we use PowerPoint presentation, and so on and so forth to teach the students. And schools have their speech laboratories, right, to improve their proficiency in English. So nowadays, it is already being used, and it's already proven effective to the students. Okay, and so those are the different methodologies in language teaching, and I hope that you've learned the focus of this approach, and I hope that you've seen also the effectiveness of this approach. Now, if you have more questions about that, you can just leave a comment in the comment box below. Now, to be updated with the latest video, you can please subscribe and click the notification bell. And that's it for today. Arigato gozaimasu, or thank you so much.